This is Tobias Capwell, historian, author, and expert on medieval and Renaissance arms and armor. Today we're taking a look at the historical epic Kingdom Come Deliverance, ahead of its upcoming sequel. If you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and let us know what games or subjects you want to see Toby or any of our other expert guests break down in a future episode. But with that, it's over to Toby.
I love that they obviously get the whole idea of beauty and awfulness existing side by side. I mean, they're showing us, some pretty nasty violence of the sacking of burning of a town, but the fields and the flowers, and it's beautiful at the same time as there's something awful going on. And that's always struck me as something that's kind of very distinctive about the Middle Ages, is that you can have awe-inspiring beauty coexisting with the worst kind of awfulness. They sit side by side in every way throughout the world. And the way they put that cutscene together, or the introduction, shows that they understand something fundamental about that period. It's good that they mix that up a little bit, that the colors are there, but they employ them in different ways on different people, because quite often in medieval films and things, they use those colors too much, and it turns into Playmobil every time. It's often comes from a misunderstanding of heraldry. That you'll have like all of Richard the Lionheart's soldiers wearing a red surcoat with the lions or leopards of England, but that's not what heraldry is. Heraldry is not team colors. Heraldry is the way of writing one person's name in colors and images. The only person who should be wearing that is Richard I. There are ways of showing that you belong to him and that you're his guy, but generally, the only person who wears the coat of arms is the person it belongs to. So here, they're playing with that, and they're trying to find a way through that maybe looks a bit more realistic and a less like, Legoland or whatever. What I'd like to see is if they change their fighting technique depending on what their opponent is wearing. Opponent with no armor, that's not hard. Multiple opponents who don't have armor against someone who has some armor now. Huh? The viewpoint is good, because you can play that first-person thing in a couple of different ways. Sometimes on first-person games, the arms and hands look like they're way, way out in front of you. I like the sense that the shield is being held very close in most of the time, and that he's guarding himself closely with the shield. That's nice. If you have an army where you have significant numbers of troops who are mounted, not just the knights, but you might very well have like mounted archers who just use the horse for transport. They ride to the battle so they can cover a lot of ground fast, and they get off and act like archers in the normal way. But then if you also have all the carts that are carrying all your gear, and you've got significant numbers of foot soldiers, it's a very, very difficult thing to keep everybody together. And sometimes you need to move fast. Sometimes there's pressure to move faster than your foot soldiers can move. What's the point in having hundreds of guys on horses if they can only move at the pace of a walking, dismounted man? So armies can easily get separated, sometimes because of bad management and sometimes because there's a very good reason. Boar hunting was a very popular pastime among knights. Gaston Phoebus, one of the famous authors of Hunt Manual at the end of the 14th century, said that he thought hunting, and especially boar hunting, was better training for war than tournaments or jousting. And with boar hunting, it's funny they pick up on that here, that normally you hunt the boars with spears or even with swords from horseback. And it's the most dangerous prey, and you face significant risk. You risk death, you risk horrible injury. So mentally, it's much better training for war. Sound here, I mean, it's quite even. You're not necessarily paying attention to what you can hear when you're in the middle of something like this. Sometimes you are, I guess, but when you get hit in the head, for example, in the helmet, it can be very loud. Suddenly very loud, like you're inside a ringing bell. There's actually a historical source that recommends coating the inside of your helmet with wax. And it says so that when someone hits you, you don't ring like a bell. And they line pieces of armor with padded textile or thin leather to try and quiet it down when you're inside it. The sound and also the tempo of strikes can be very irregular and dissonant. It's kind of a habit in film and television anyway that strikes start to get quite regular. You see a choreographed fight in a Shakespeare play or something, they do all the moves in kind of this even rhythm, and you kind of lose that sense of suddenness and spontaneity and bang bang, and then nothing for a while, and then bang 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 bang, and then nothing for a while. But the sort of chaotic sound design is probably a good idea. I mean, there's some good stuff here. I like that it's not over the top. Sometimes with sound effects in film, television, and games, when someone gets hit in armor, it's quite obviously a Foley artist with a big hammer hitting an anvil. Pang! And sometimes you get loud sounds if you're like, it's the reinforcing plate on an armor, and the reinforcing plate gets knocked off and it's actually ringing as it sails off of you or something like that. You do get loud, unusually dramatic sounds, but not all the time. Sometimes you just get dull thunks. I like in this game, I like the sound that the thrusts are making. Sometimes it doesn't seem to make much sound at all. And again, the game designers have to not just do what is realistic, but also have sounds that, again, emphasize the false tactile qualities of the game. Your actions, your virtual actions need to make satisfying sounds. But there, they hit the haft of the weapon. There was a very woody sound, and contrasting with metal hitting metal. They have put some work into that. I really like to see the V-shaped stop ribs that they've got on a lot of the breastplates. That's a very typical thing of the early 15th century. It's very distinctive of the early 15th century. It was a very effective idea for deflecting glancing points away from your throat. We did a series of archery experiments where we actually showed those V-shaped stop ribs in action. You can see like an arrow, heavy arrow, shot from a high-powered longbow or war bow. It hits and then glances and gets stuck, and sometimes even just channels off and zings off harmlessly because of that V-shaped stop rib. Over time, they get smaller, and they start to become just these little applied crescents of steel, and then they disappear. But they, at the time, they were, extremely effective. And when you see that as an armor person, you immediately know what time period you're in, or it's one of these markers that really should be there if this is honestly the date that we're talking about. Grabbing of the blade is a totally real thing. You have to be careful when you're doing it. As long as you keep a really firm grip, it won't cut you. It'll cut you if it slips, but if you don't let it slip, if you hold it, and you only need to foul that blade and hold it for a second while you do something else. It's not like you're gonna spend half the fight with that blade in your hand. So you just need to grab it and hold on for a short time as part of another technique. You see it all the way through, medieval fight books. There are strikes where you're holding like a longsword by the blade and striking with the hilt, almost like you're turning it into a poleaxe or something, and striking with the pommel and things too. There's also, of course, half-swording techniques, which are mainly used for fighting men in armor, where you can't slash them with the blade. You have to stab quite forcefully, and you have to shorten your grip to get in close. So there are a lot of half sorting techniques are called that because you've got one hand on the blade and the other hand in the hilt, and you're basically shortening the reach of the sword by half, more or less. So there's a lot of that kind of thing. And not all of these weapons are like super razor sharp either. They're not all the sharpness of kitchen knives.
All is prepared for the first duel. We will witness a duel with longswords.
In early tournaments, like of the 12th and 13th centuries, if you defeated someone in that more formalized context, all of their gear was forfeited to you. Their armor, their horse, everything now belongs to you. And that's not all stuff you're necessarily going to wear yourself, but you can readily turn it into cash. And often when you read about armor being given to family members in wills, it's not for the son to wear dad's armor, it's for the son to sell and turn into cash. Cash is tied up in everything. When you own armor, a lot of money is tied up in that, potentially. That's sometimes you find a deceased knight in his will giving his armor to his church just because it's another form of currency and they can pass it on and change it for whatever they need. So it's more complex than taking your enemy's armor and wearing it yourself, although that must have happened to some extent. But the rules of plunder are very specific too. Like just because you beat someone on the battlefield and there's dead people lying around in nice gear, doesn't mean you get to keep whatever you take. Normally there are very strict rules on how plunder is managed. And if you're a lower ranking archer, you take whatever you can, but then you have to surrender it all to your captain. And then your captain and the officers will then parcel all of the loot out according to status. So you might get some of it back, but you're not going to get to keep. If you're some random archer and you find the Duke of Burgundy's fabulously gilded helmet that's fretted with pearls and set with rubies and sapphires, you don't get to wear that, and you don't get to keep that. That's going up the line. But would you actually want it? If you've just killed someone and they've bled all over the inside of it, you're not going to necessarily want to just stick it straight on, are you? Oh, cool. Like it. You've got a champ close there, a little barricaded arena. So is it understood that you're not supposed to be killing each other here?
Yeah.
Formal combats like this became very popular in the second half of the 14th century. It's really the root of competitive tournament combat on foot, are these so-called deeds of arms, where, especially in periods of peace, fighting men, or specifically knights, still want places where they can show their prowess and increase their fame. The best place to do that is on the battlefield, but if there's no battles, you have to create other opportunities. I've seen tournament rules where they specifically say you get extra points if you make your opponent bleed, and you get more extra points if you knock a tooth out or break his collarbone or something like that. Fighting with the visor down, huh? That's basically what it's like. Maybe even they've still given you a bit more visibility, actually. That's another thing about assessing your opponent's equipment as you approach him. You should be able to tell something about his field of view. I fought in a tournament in Italy where one of the cunning older competitors, he kept a really, really low carriage on his sword. He held his sword really low because he knew you couldn't see him and his sword at the same time. He's purposefully taking advantage of the field of view that he anticipates that you have. And you don't know what to look at, He could come up and stab you and you won't necessarily see it coming. And he just confuses, it's like distraction. Something going on over here. And when they show you the restricted view of the visor, you can start to see how that really matters. And if you get in close with someone fighting in a visor, you can put your hand over their sights for a second if you need to. There are techniques where you just blind them for a second. Just to give yourself that beat, you need to do something else. I don't know whether they worked it in or not, but One thing I like to see in armored combat too is if you're really familiar with the capacity of your armor and you know what your armor can take. There's plenty of times in a fight where someone will attack you and you don't even bother to make any kind of defensive movement at all because you know it's not going to hurt you. And you take that time to counterattack into them. You know, why bother to block everything when it's just going to hit your armor and do precisely nothing? But knowing how to judge that, you don't want to get that wrong. You don't want to just let someone's attack in. It just takes a lot of experience and practice. But you know, a counter attack into an attack with no defense, you know, there should actually be a lot of that. We get into the habit of, when in choreographed theater or film fights, there always has to be this kind of back and forth, trading blows, your turn, my turn, your turn, my turn, defense and attack. When actually, in reality, there's a lot of simultaneous attacking and a lot of forgetting about defense, even when it would have been a good idea to defend yourself. I mean, overall, this is so different. This is so good. This has constant reference to reality. There's so much research on show here. You know, it's just kind of washing over me. And I'm not seeing any of the stuff that usually irritates me. I'm not seeing any of the annoying kind of cliches that you often get. I like what I'm seeing a lot. And I don't have anything apart from tiny nitpicks that really would just be churlish at this point. There's always things you can do better, and you know, with the sequel, I'm sure that will be, you know, another major step up. I'm really happy to hear, you know, what an impact this game has made and how kind of socially and culturally relevant it's shown itself to be, because you can see why it matters, why it's relevant. You can see the real historical, cultural underpinnings of this. It demonstrates why historical, you know, accuracy can be a good thing, you know, purely in commercial terms, quite apart from what people like me think. Depending on how well a particular force is equipped and who they are, you know, they can really look like they all belong together and they all have equipment of comparable quality, and you know, it's all new gear and they all look like they come from the same place. But then really a lot of medieval armies undoubtedly had a lot of a more heterogeneous sort of look, where some people are wearing older equipment than others and a mix of different styles, and I think it could vary a lot. And the trick is to show, in something like this, to show some degree of variation, but find ways also of showing that they all belong together. You know, too much variety can start to look like a mess. But then again, real medieval armies did sometimes look like a mess. I just recently worked on a publication of a sketchbook, early 16th century sketchbook, kept by an engineer named Paul Dolstein, who also served as a German mercenary. And he was involved in campaigns in the Low Countries and then up into Sweden. And he periodically just drew these quick little sketches of his friends, and he also draws what the enemy looks like. And he's a couple of places where he shows you the opposing forces, and wow, the equipment is sometimes just all over the place. There's people in there wearing helmets that are 100 years old. And one knight's amazingly well equipped, the next one's got old gear or lower status gear or matching bits of this and bits of that. I mean, there are some levels where, you know, ruthless historical authenticity might start looking kind of weird. And sometimes it's maybe hard to know how far to go with that. I mean, that game's a few years old now, isn't it?
2018.
But 2018, okay, 6 years on. It still holds up. It still looks great. you know, from the point of view of a really thoughtful exploration of a real historical environment, I can't think that it's been bettered. I can't wait to see what these guys do with the next one.
Thank you so much for watching. Remember to comment below for what other games you'd like to see on the show, and be sure to subscribe for more content like this and beyond.